Bilingual education timeline. Brown v. Board of Education was a landmark 1954 Supreme Court case where the judges ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This case was a cornerstone of the civil rights movement and helped establish the idea that separate but equal education is not at all equal. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled, following Plessy v. Ferguson, that segregated public facilities were legal, as long as the separate facilities for both blacks and whites were equal. Oliver Brown filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1951 after his daughter Linda was denied the right to attend any of Topeka's all-white elementary schools. In the Brown v. Board of Education case, the Supreme Court ruled that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. A year later, the court ordered steps to be taken in order to desegregate all public schools in the United States. Brown made it very clear that the states are in charge of providing students with these equal education opportunities. This ruling paved the way for quality bilingual programs. The National Defense Act of 1958. This law passed following the launch of Sputnik, which showed the successful efforts of the Soviet Union's space exploration. The U.S. realized that the Soviet Union was more educated in these fields, which made them more powerful. The National Defense Education Act was an effort to improve learning and take back control of space exploration. It focused on improving science, mathematics, and foreign language learning at the national level. It also encouraged further education beyond high school. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This was a federal act which showed a long-term commitment to equal opportunity of all students. It authorizes state-run programs for eligible schools in hopes to raise academic success of struggling learners. The ESEA also addresses the challenges of students who face language or cultural barriers. The main target for this act was schools who have large numbers of students living in poverty. Following the passing of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, there was a lot of confusion about the lines of authority among federal, state, and local officials. Previously, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ensured that all children received equal chances to succeed. On the contrary, the ESEA provided financial support to schools with high poverty rates to fund bilingual education programs. Since 1965, this act has been reauthorized 6 times, each time becoming more and more clear on its goals. The Bilingual Education Act. The Civil Rights Movement, which ended in 1968, led educators and policymakers to see the needs of the rapidly growing language minority student population. The 1960 census pointed out a high dropout rate among Mexican American students, who only attended an average of 5 years of school. On the other hand, white students completed an average of 14 years. In 1966, a conference on the education of Spanish-speaking children led to a report, The Invisible Minority, which outlined areas of concern and laid out education programs making use of students' home language. Just 2 years later, the Bilingual Education Act was passed and entered into federal law as Title VII of the ESEA Act that I previously spoke about. Its main purpose was to provide funding to school districts and other eligible organizations through a competitive grant process. The original version of the Bilingual Education Act was very vague about solutions and didn't even include a definition of bilingual education. This led to more confusion regarding the purpose and goals of Title VII. Since 1968, the ESEA has been altered many times. With each change, the focus of the law remained constant, which was to help ELLs become fluent in English. However, they expanded the types of programs eligible to receive funding. This act remained in effect until 2002. Liu v. Nichols, 1970. This case took place in San Francisco, California. A poverty lawyer learned that one of his client's children was failing in school due to not understanding language and instruction. It was a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of Kenny Liu and 1,789 other Chinese background students in the same situation. The children were being denied education on equal terms. It resulted in a consent agreement to provide bilingual education for the city's Chinese, Filipino, and Hispanic children. In 1975, investigators followed up by visiting 334 school districts with language minority students. Most of these schools failed to meet responsibilities. Cerna versus Portales Municipal Schools, 1972. This case was filed on behalf of Jude Cerna, a Mexican-American student in New Mexico. The school district failed to provide bilingual education. It also argued that teachers and administrators of Mexican-American descent were not hired in the school. This led to the first court mandate for bilingual education. The federal judge ordered instruction in children's native language and culture. It was part of the desegregation plan. It made education equal by setting up bilingual and bicultural programs and provided more opportunities for minority students to succeed. The Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. It declared, "No state shall deny educational opportunities to an individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin." It required school districts to take action to overcome barriers which denied students equal participation. Since then, there have been several lawsuits that have been based on this legislation. Liu remedies. These were a result of the Liu versus Nichols case. It went after districts that ignored the needs of ELLs. They told these districts, 1. How to identify and evaluate children with limited English skills. 2. What instructional modifications would be appropriate. 3. When children were ready for mainstream classrooms. And 4. What professional standards teachers should meet. It essentially required districts to implement bilingual education opportunities. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 is the most recent version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's a federal law that provides money for extra educational assistance to poor children in return for improvements on their academic process. NCLB is according to the United States Constitution, states have the primary responsibility for public education. However, if states want to receive federal NCLB funds, they must agree to the law's requirements to establish learning standards, create annual assessments, set a level at which students are considered proficient in tested areas, and report to the public what percent of students are proficient. Race to the Top in 2009. This was a program that was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which included $44 billion in the education funding. Race to the Top provided an additional $4 billion in competitive grants for states to begin education reforms. States receiving grants must follow these certain regulations. Adopt internationally benchmarked standards that prepare students to succeed in college. Recruit, develop, reward, and retain effective teachers and principals. Increase transparency by using data systems which measure student success. And support effective intervention strategies to help turn around even the lowest performing schools.